Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Jamara Davis Welch, and I'm back with some more insights from my new book, High Value, The Prayer of a Queen. In our last video, we saw this incredible moment where Esther is looking absolutely stunning in her royal apparel. She's walked through all of those palace doors and she faints right in front of the king. She actually fainted twice. Now remember how God changed Artaxerxes' heart from anger to gentleness? Well, what happens next is remarkable. To me, it's a masterclass in wisdom and strategy. Picture this. Artaxerxes has just leaped from his throne to go and comfort Esther, and he offers her what I would call a blank check, up to half of his kingdom. And let me tell you just how massive this offer was. We're talking about 127 provinces extending from India to Ethiopia. If you were to pull up a map right now, you'd see just how vast this territory was. Now, here's something interesting that a lot of people don't know. These ancient borders were very different from what we see today. Let me give you a quick ancient geography lesson. When we hear Ethiopia today, we think of the modern country, which historically was known as the Kingdom of Axum and later Abyssinia. But ancient Ethiopia, that was enormous. We're talking present-day Ethiopia, as well as the countries we now know as Sudan, Eritrea, and Yemen. Further, the ancient Greeks and Romans, they used the term Ethiopia to describe land south of Egypt, extending all the way west into what we now call the Sahel region. In fact, Ethiopia was so significant that the body of water that we now call the Atlantic was actually called the Ethiopian Ocean on these ancient maps. And if you don't believe me, go look up some of those old African maps from the 19th century and earlier, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This will give you an idea of just how vast and influential this region was during ancient times. So when Artaxerxes offers Esther up to half his kingdom, this was no small gesture. And here's what I find so intriguing. With the fate of her entire people hanging in the balance, Esther could ask for anything. And what does she do? She invites the king and Haman to dinner. Think about that. She invites them to dinner. She doesn't immediately blurt out her request or reveal her hand. Instead, she exercises something that's rare these days. And I would argue that that is discretion. You see, Esther understood something powerful about timing, creating the right environment, and when to speak. Her strategy was brilliant if you think about it. Now, watch how this all plays out. During the first dinner, and let me tell you, given Artaxerxes' penchant for luxury, I can only imagine the scene. This wasn't just any dinner. We're talking about a feast fit for the most powerful king in the world in a chamber that was probably gleaming with gold and all sorts of precious gems, the finest Persian tapestries, silks, and the most exquisite dishes. I'm sure that Esther knew how to create an atmosphere that matched the gravity of what she was about to ask for. Now, during this opulent feast, the king knows something's up. I mean, he's not naive. He realizes that Esther didn't just risk her life to host a dinner party. So he asks her again, what is your request? What do you want? It's yours. Are you seeing this? Here's where Esther's wisdom shines. I want you to picture this. She responds with such delicate diplomacy. She says, if I have found favor in your sight, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do the same. In other words, she was inviting them to join her once again for dinner the following day, and then she would make her request. You see how she was creating this perfect atmosphere? I wouldn't say that she was just stalling. She was building anticipation while maintaining the king's interest. She was careful not to test his patience, yet she was still making sure that everything was perfectly set for her big request. This is what I call tapping into divine strategy. Because Esther was under divine counsel from the Most High, she knew how, what, and when to say what she needed. Now, between those two dinners, God orchestrates some amazing events. That night, the king is unable to sleep. This leads him to review the court records, and what does he find out? That Mordecai had saved his life from an assassination plot, but was never honored for it. This divine insomnia sets up a chain of events that would make the timing of Esther's next dinner impeccable. Now, this second dinner is where everything comes together. And for those of you that are familiar with the story, we know that Mordecai had just been honored in the most ironic way. You see, when the king had discovered that Mordecai had saved his life, he asked Haman, how should someone the king delights to honor be treated? And Haman, thinking that the king was talking about him, suggested this elaborate parade where the honoree should wear the king's robe and ride the king's horse and have one of the king's most noble princes lead him through the streets proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." If you think about it, Haman wanted to be the king, but we can talk about that later. Anyways, I want you to imagine Haman's face when the king tells him, "Perfect, now go do all of that for Mordecai." The same man that Haman had planned to hang that morning, he now had to parade through the streets like royalty. God really does have a sense of humor. So by the time the second dinner begins, Mordecai has been publicly honored, Haman has been thoroughly embarrassed, and the king is ready to hear Esther's request. Now, when Artaxerxes asks Esther again, he says to her, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you, even to the half of the kingdom. It shall be done." Watch how Esther responds. With trembling in her voice, but strength in her words, she says, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king is beyond shocked. Who would dare? Who would have the audacity to threaten his queen? And now at this perfect moment, when all the pieces are in place, Esther turns and points directly at Haman and declares, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Can you picture it? Do you see it? At this point, the king is so furious, he has to step out into the garden to collect himself. I imagine him out there pacing back and forth, trying to process everything that had just happened. Meanwhile, Haman, realizing that he's in serious trouble, starts begging Esther for mercy. But his timing couldn't have been worse, at least for him. When the king comes back in and he sees that Haman has fallen on the couch where Esther is reclining, that was the nail in the coffin. We all know what happens next. The king orders Haman's execution, and he's hung on the very gallows that he had erected for Mordecai. This is what happens when God orchestrates events. And as a sidebar and a word to the wise, as well as a reminder to self, don't try to move ahead of God. Trust his timing. Anyway, everything Haman had planned for Mordecai's destruction became the instrument of his own downfall, which reminds me of the Bible verse which says, "No weapon formed against me shall prosper," Isaiah 54:17. And all of this happened because Esther exercised the wisdom of discretion and perfect timing in how she presented her case. Now, let me pause here for a moment just to talk a little bit more about discretion. You see, what made Esther high value wasn't just her position as queen. It was her wisdom in how she handled delicate matters. And let me share what discretion really means, because to me, this treasure of wisdom seems to be overlooked nowadays. Discretion is having the wisdom to know when to speak and when to be silent, how to handle sensitive information, and how to carry yourself with self-control. It's about understanding the right time, the right way, and the right amount to share. In a world where social media tempts us to share our every thought and move, Esther shows us another way, perhaps a better way. And let me tell you what Proverbs 11:22 says about this. "As a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a lovely woman who lacks discretion." Now that's some strong language. The Bible is telling us that beauty without discretion is like putting a gold ring in a pig's nose. The message couldn't be clearer. Further, Proverbs 2:11 tells us, "Discretion shall preserve thee, understanding shall keep thee." This isn't about never sharing. It's about sharing with wisdom and purpose. For the people in the back of the room, again, it's about sharing with wisdom and purpose. Esther knew when to speak and when to wait. And she understood the importance of creating the right environment before presenting her case. She demonstrated godly wisdom. She didn't just blurt out her requests in the heat of emotion. She didn't just rush to expose Haman immediately. Instead, she exercised patience, wisdom, all of which is strategic thinking. And look at the result. Not only was she heard, but her approach created the perfect conditions for justice to be served. So what can we learn from Esther's example? She shows us that when we align ourselves with God's timing, He orchestrates events in ways we could never have imagined. Her story also reminds us that wisdom often looks like patience, discretion, and creating the right environment before making our move. I encourage you to think about this. Where in your life might God be asking you to wait for His perfect timing instead of rushing ahead? Or think about how you're doing in the area of discretion. Could that be tightened up a bit? In closing, remember, depending on your preferred platform, you can find my content on TikTok at SM Society JW, on Instagram at the SM Society, and on YouTube at the Supermodel Society. Also, if you haven't already done so, go get your copy of my book, High Value, The Prayer of a Queen. You can get it on Amazon as well as Google Play. With that, salama and barakah, in other words, peace and blessings.